I'm
Multitask.
pressing got it. I'm not pressing the close button. Okay, okay. Hello, hello, and welcome. Thursdays at 11 are QT conversations. QT conversations are an opportunity for tutors to explore relevant topics and issues in the tutoring world with no agenda, really, just a random, open forum, rambling discussion of what's on our mind and what's relevant in tutoring today. And although most of us are in exam mode right now and spending way too much time with teenagers, um, what we're actually going to be talking about today is something slightly different. Jordan Hayden from the Disclosure and Barring Service has joined us to begin to open a conversation between DBS and qualified tutor. And the reason why we're doing this is because, as you know, for us, it's all about raising standards in tutoring together, where the together pieces are always the most important because that's how you bring people with you. That's how you make grassroots, bottom up change that makes a difference to people on the ground and not top down change that whacks people over the head with irrelevant sticks. So we believe he's gone. Sorry, it was too funny. So we believe, oh, he's back. We believe that DBS should be standard. We believe that every tutor should have their DBS checked. They should have enhanced DBS and they should be on the update service because working with students and vulnerable adults is a huge responsibility. And the best thing that we can do is create safe cultures. And the way that we do that is by creating as many filters and barriers to entry for anybody who might be a predator or perpetrator of abuse. We will not be focusing on abuse today, on child abuse today, because it's not actually a safeguarding conversation. The goal here, Jordan and I have discussed this already, is to understand what disclosure and barring covers, the history of the concept of disclosure and barring, how it helps us today, and how we can use it to create regulation in an unregulated space. Jordan, we touched before in our conversations about the various gig economies that have popped up because of online marketplaces in all sorts of ways. We know that as tutors, we're working so closely with our students that we have to be really proactive about creating safe spaces. But there are many other professions and economies out there, industries out there that are also unregulated and are beginning to engage with DBS in the way that qualified tutor is. There's one more piece that I wanted to put out there, and that is that we put out a poll on LinkedIn last week, and we asked how often tutors have been asked for DBS from parents. And the resounding majority, 80% plus, said never. They'd never been asked for DBS. And that's something that we want to explore also because we don't agree with it and we do understand it. As a parent in a school, you never have to ask for DBS because you can take it for granted. And it feels a bit icky to ask for DBS because really you ask somebody if they have a criminal record. And so there are those sort of icky factors to unpack, understandings of parents and what the norms are. But before we do any of that, I'm going to introduce Jordan. We're going to unpack disclosure and barring, a little bit of a glossary of terms. Don't assume that we know what you're talking about because we don't. It's really, really niche and specific, but we are way curious. So, Jordan, over to you.
Thanks, Julia, and morning, everyone. Thank you very much for having me along today. It's a pleasure to get to speak to you all. Um, Basically, today, what I'm going to do is just give a very, very brief introduction to obviously myself and DBS, and then provide really just an opportunity to kind of open it up for questions. So, some of the most common things you've come across regarding DBS in your day-to-day roles, and particularly any barriers or roadblocks that you come across when you're engaged in your professional roles, and how we might be able to either answer some queries relating to them, try and resolve some of those issues for you, and try and provide a little bit more clarity and understanding about DBS, about tutoring specifically, and looking at obviously DBS checks and a wider safer recruitment environment as well. So just a brief introduction to myself. I've been asked to come along to today's meeting to speak to yourselves, and my name is Jordan Hayden, and I'm actually the regional outreach advisor for DBS for the Northwest region. So DBS does have a regional outreach service which aims to provide a regional outreach advisor for every region of England, Wales, and Northern Ireland, to have a point of contact for all of our partners to come to for any queries, advice, guidance, support, training, anything that you can think of that relates to DBS safeguard and safe recruitment. We're here to try and provide that type of support. And as I say, I'm the outreach advisor for the Northwest, but I'm here to talk to you today about obviously today's session. So just an introduction, obviously, about the DBS, the Disclosure and Barring Service. So we operate disclosure and barring functions on behalf of the UK government. So we provide disclosure functions for England, Wales, and the Channel Isles. And these cover things based in legislation, such as the different types of DBS check that are available, so the different levels of DBS check that are available, as well as what does somebody have to be doing in order to be eligible for those levels of check. So the level of check someone is able to apply for. Oh, sorry, Julie, I can see your hand.
Do I have your permission to interrupt you and ask you to clarify things throughout?
Absolutely,
awesome.
Please do.
So
I would
what
encourage
does disclosure
you to.
mean? In this context, what does disclosure mean?
So in terms of the Disclosure and Barring Service, disclosure means the disclosing or providing of information to employers, to voluntary organisations regarding individuals that is relevant to their suitability to carry out a role. So that could be criminal information relating to their conviction history, any cautions that individuals received, or in some levels of check, it could also be what's known as relevant police intelligence. So that's information that's held by the police that they believe is relevant to an individual's job role that they've applied for, but may not necessarily be conviction or caution information. But I will touch on that a little bit more when I talk about the different levels of check. But that's what we mean by the disclosure function. So essentially information that is disclosed by the Disclosure and Barring Service. So information
and
that
I can't
is put on a
resist.
DBS
So what does
check,
barring
on a DBS
mean?
certificate. And the barring functions, which I would have come on to next, is basically what we mean by the DBS has the ability to place individuals who pose a risk of harm to either children or vulnerable adults, or potentially both. DBS has the ability to place those individuals on what's called a barred list, which means they are legally barred, meaning they are legally prohibited from working in what's known for the DBS as regulated activity, which again I will touch on in more detail. Working in regulated activity with children or vulnerable adults. So if you are placed on a barred list, you can be placed on the children's barred list or the adults barred list, or you can be placed on both. And if you are on one of those barred lists, it is then a criminal offence for you to seek to work, offer to work, or look to work in regulated activity when you are barred on those lists. So those are the two functions that are provided by the Disclosure and Barring Service. So we can think of it as one way that Julie and I spoke about it that can help is a lot of you may be more familiar with, as we come across on outreach, the term CRB rather than DBS, and that is the Criminal Records Bureau. So people will have said that people are CRB checked, have you got your CRB certificate, and that is the Criminal Records Bureau. So in 2012, with the introduction of the Protection of Freedoms Act, the Criminal Records Bureau, CRB, and the Independent Safeguarding Authority, ISA, were merged into one organisation known as the Disclosure and Barring Service. So there are very much two different elements to the DBS, but it is all done under one house. And as I just mentioned, the disclosure side of things, i.e. Before somebody is recruited, so before somebody is employed, so the disclosure of information relating to their conviction history, caution information, police intelligence is the disclosure side, and the barring side is after someone is potentially employed, if there is a safeguarding concern, taking the steps to potentially place them on a barred list so that they can be legally prohibited from working with those vulnerable groups, so we can try and avoid there being a future risk of harm to those groups as well. So those are the two functions that the DBS provide. And as Julia said, today is looking more on the disclosure side of things rather than barring. But for anyone who is interested in the barring functions and the safeguarding side of things, we have a ton of resources available on the DBS website, and we do also offer workshop support, advice, guidance, anything that you're interested in. You can come to either myself, the outreach team, or your regional outreach advisor specifically. But today we'll mostly just be looking at the disclosure side of things, which there's plenty to talk about in itself relating to disclosure. So we'll talk about things such as the different levels of checks that are available and the types of information that are disclosed on those checks, as I said, and then any experiences yourselves have had with the checks or disclosure side of things or the recruitment side of things. So as I mentioned, there are different levels of check that are available. And the level of check that someone can actually apply for is based on legislative criteria. So things that are written in legislation that means someone is eligible for a level of check based on a number of different factors. So it could include who they're working with, what are they doing, how often are they doing it. Sometimes for the higher levels of checks, it's not just about what they're doing, it's also about how often are they doing it. You can also think about if they're being sufficiently supervised. And also, in some circumstances, it can be based on where a person works. So there are certain rules that mean people can be eligible for higher levels of check if they work in certain places or certain establishments. But these are all different factors that we have to think about when we're looking at what level of DBS check can an individual actually apply for. So it's not a case of just applying for the highest level that you think is appropriate based on the level of risk you think there is. There is actually legislative criteria that have to be met in order to apply for those levels of check. Now, we have a basic DBS check, which is the first check I'll talk about, and this is available to anybody. So regardless of what their job role is, any of those other factors that I've just mentioned, anybody can be asked to apply for a basic check. And a basic check
Jordan,
will
hold on a
provide
sec. Hold on, Tim has a question.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Just to say, I can't see anyone's hands. I've had to dial in using my phone because my laptop wouldn't let me join. So if anyone does have any questions, raise your hand.
It's actually fine. I think you're about actually to embark on the thing that I was about to ask you about. So I'm going to be quiet and just let you speak.
Okay, Bob. But if anyone does want to just interrupt, please do. I just encourage this to be an open Q&A forum. Anything I can answer, I'm happy to answer. And anything I can't, I'll be happy to take away with me and get you a more detailed and accurate response. But as I said, a basic check is available to anybody. So again, regardless of what their job role is, any of the other factors that I mentioned, anybody can be asked to apply for a basic check. And a basic check will give you any information relating to unspent convictions and cautions that an individual might have. Now, as I said, the basic check is available to anybody. But when we look above a basic check, so standard, enhanced, and enhanced with barred lists, those are the levels of check in which there are legislative criteria that have to be met, meaning you do have to meet certain points to be able to apply for those levels of check. So the next level up from a basic check is a standard DBS check. And to be able to apply for a standard DBS check, you have to meet any of the criteria that's set out in the Rehabilitation of Offenders Act exceptions order. And this will give a number of roles and a number of criteria that are in place. That means that if you are carrying out one of those roles, then you can apply for a standard check. Now, I won't talk too much about standard checks in this session because it's quite cut and dry in terms of whether you can or can't apply for it. And we do have a standard guide on the DBS website that gives you a full list of the roles that are eligible for a standard check. And the difference between a standard check and a basic check is a standard check will also give you information about unspent convictions and conditional cautions, subject to what's known as the filtering rules. And I'll talk a little bit more about the filtering rules after I've covered all the levels of check. Up from a standard check, we have an enhanced check. And as with a standard check and enhanced, will give you the same information relating to conviction and caution information. So it will give you information about unspent and spent convictions and cautions, again, subject to the filtering rules. But an enhanced level check is also the level that will provide you what's known as relevant police intelligence. So this is information that the police forces might hold about an individual that isn't related to any convictions or cautions that that person might have, but the police still believe is relevant to the job role and the workforce that that person is applied to work in, and therefore do still have the ability to disclose that information on an enhanced level check if they believe that it is relevant and should be disclosed. And finally, we have an enhanced with barred list check, which is the highest level of DBS check available. And that'll give you the same conviction and police intelligence that an enhanced check will. But this is the level of check that will also let you know whether or not an individual is on one of those barred lists that I mentioned. So it'll let you know whether an individual is legally barred from working in regulated activity with children or vulnerable adults, or both. Now, I think this is probably a useful...
Sorry, Jordan, I've just realised that you can't see the cues. That's the place where teachers and tutors should sit, isn't it?
Yes. So in terms of what I was just going to say is, which I think is useful to mention, there's the term regulated activity is something you'll hear a lot in relation to DBS, particularly when we're looking at enhanced with barred list checks and being barred from regulated activity. Now, one of the areas of confusion that tends to pop up when we talk about regulated activity is some sectors, much like yourselves, I imagine, will be carrying out work that is quote unquote unregulated. And therefore, when they hear the term regulated activity in terms of DBS, they may think it doesn't apply. When I use the term regulated activity and when you hear it regarding DBS, it refers to activity that is mentioned in the Safeguarding Vulnerable Groups Act 2006 as being regulated activity, and therefore is eligible for those highest levels of DBS check, meaning the enhanced checks with the barred list checks.
And what are those, Jordan?
So in terms of regulated activities, I won't go into them all in this specific session, just because eligibility is probably one of the most complex areas of DBS checks. We provide specific workshops relating to eligibility and disclosure functions, but we do have detailed guidance that's available on what is regulated activity. In terms of yourselves, the thing that's probably most relevant is going to be regulated activity with children, and that does include providing any form of teaching, training, or instruction to children if it is being done often enough to meet what we call the period condition. Now, the period condition relates to what I mentioned earlier when we're thinking about what level of check can someone apply for. It's not just about who they're working with or what they're doing. When we're looking at the highest levels of check, so the enhanced and the enhanced with barred list, we also do have to think about how often is someone carrying out a certain activity, and is it often enough to be in regulated activity. So that's what we mean by the period condition when we're talking about regulated activity with children. For the majority of activities, they have to be done either on more than 3 days in a 30-day period, or once overnight between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m. with the opportunity for contact with children. So for tutoring, it's unlikely, and it may apply, but it's unlikely that it'll be the overnight between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m. criteria. So looking at regulated activity when it refers to tutoring is most likely going to be providing teaching, training, or instruction to children on more than 3 days in a 30-day period. So that is what somebody would have to be doing in order to be eligible for that enhanced DBS check with a check of the children's barred list.
And just to clarify, because you and I have discussed this, that means 3 single sessions on 3 separate days.
Yeah, so it would technically be 4, because it would have to be more than 3 days. So if somebody is carrying out tutoring on 4 days within a 30-day period, they don't have to be consecutively, they don't have to be with the same children. It just has to be on more than 3 days.
And it doesn't have to be a full day. It could just be one session.
Yes, as long as they are doing it on that day, then that would count towards the period condition of being on more than 3 days in a 30-day period. One thing I will just touch on quickly while we're talking about eligibility is there is a different there's a key thing to be aware of in terms of that period condition, whereby sometimes we'll hear from organisations that say somebody is carrying out what would be considered regulated activity with children if it was done often enough, but they are only doing it, say, 2 or 3 times within that 30-day period, and therefore it doesn't count as regulated activity. And there's some concern there of, well, why is that level of check not available to us? Does that mean we can only apply for a standard or a basic check? One thing to touch on that is really important is if someone is carrying out an activity that would be considered regulated activity with children if it was done often enough, but they aren't carrying it out enough times to meet that period condition, those roles are still eligible for an enhanced DBS check, just without a check of the children's barred list, because it doesn't meet those criteria for regulated activity. So if it's more than 3 days, then it does have that eligibility for the barred list check.
Barred list check.
But even if it's not, that enhanced check is still available for those that are providing teaching, training, or instruction to children.
That feels good. I'm comfortable with that. Tim, go ahead.
Sorry, just trying to find the mute button. From my point of view, I don't employ anybody else, and I don't see that happening in the immediate future. I'm really more interested in this for my own providing a DBS check for my customers. can I apply for my own DBS check at whatever level I wish it to be? Do I need to meet criteria to ask to be checked by myself, or what's the story?
Yeah, so that's a really good point, and it's probably something I was going to touch on in terms of the logistics side of things. So, in terms of applying for DBS checks, one of the really crucial things that is coming up more and more often as well. I know Julie and I spoke about in terms of what other sectors do DBS and outreach specifically engage with, and we do engage with sectors across the board, from grassroots all the way up to senior executive level, and particularly one question that does come up quite often is in terms of individuals who are self-employed, and what level of DBS check can they apply for. One of the key things to think about in terms of applying for a standard or an enhanced level DBS check is it has to come through to DBS via a registered body that is able to submit that DBS check in the aims of making a suitability decision in the office of their employment. What that means in simple terms is there has to be a third-party organisation that is going to be using that DBS check in order to make a suitability decision about whether the person being checked is suitable to carry out the role that they are applying to work in. The key issue, which why that exists and why self-employed people can't apply for those levels of checks, is because for self-employed individuals, there is not a third party that is making a suitability decision as to whether or not they can carry out that job role based on the information that's been disclosed on their DBS check. Otherwise, there may be individuals who can apply for a DBS check if they were self-employed, for example, but when they receive that check, a self-employed individual is never going to say that they themselves are unsuitable to carry out the job role that they want to carry out, because they are the ones making the decision themselves. Oh, Tim, you're still on my screen, so I can see your hand there.
Yeah, sorry. So I'm sorry to monopolise the conversation. I'll stop in a minute. So I have applied for a DBS check. I've got a DBS check through a third party, and they've sent me a certificate. But it says that I didn't apply for the adults barred list, and I'm thinking, well, that doesn't really look very good if I'm presenting that to some parents and saying, look, here's my DBS check, and it says didn't apply for the adults bar list. Is there a way around that for me? Can I get a DBS check for myself through a third party agency that would basically say, yeah, this guy's safe to be in contact with your kids over the internet, because that's what I actually want?
That's exactly what we offer for you, Tim. Qualified Tutors set itself up to be that third party to solve this problem, because it's not good enough for tutors to not have access to enhanced DBS.
Okay, so I could get an enhanced DBS check.
That's right.
Okay,
That's right.
All right, great.
One of the other
sorry, I'm going to say one more thing. Sorry. So is that an enhanced plus, or is that an enhanced? Because I've got an enhanced one. That's not been a problem. It's the enhanced plus that I need. Because the box that says, I'm actually looking at the certificate now. The box that says, I was looking at it, and now I've managed to make it move to somewhere else as per usual, but never mind.
Well, I'm not going to have an answer for you because Hannah, who processes these, is not able to jump back on this call at the moment. So I'm going to follow up with you afterwards on this, if that's
okay. That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, awesome.
Can I ask a quick question? Sorry.
Yes, come on, Dee.
I've just had Tim. I've just had a quick look at my certificate, and in every section it says none recorded, other than DBS adults barred list information not requested. So that's something that QT can sort out for me, is it?
I don't know, Jordan. You and I were talking about the barred list element, weren't we?
So I've got for the children's barred list, it says none recorded. So that's been done, but the adults barred list not requested.
Yeah, so what that'll mean is you've applied for an enhanced DBS check with a children's barred list check, because you are going to be working in regulated activity with children, and that's why it'll say non-recorded, meaning that you, the recipient of the check, are not on the children's barred list. So that's why it'll say non-recorded. The adults barred list will not have been requested because you are not in regulated activity with adults as part of the tutoring role that you will have applied for the check for. So if it says non-recorded, it'll mean that barred list has been checked and there's no information recorded about that individual on the relevant barred list. And if it says not requested, then it means that the barred list status on that list has not been requested as part of the DBS check, because the individual isn't going to be in regulated activity with either adults or children, depending on which one says not requested.
Jordan,
it is important.
I think what's sort of percolating here in my mind, the question that's really percolating is why is DBS limiting how much we can ask for? So I know that when Hannah and I do these and we request the adult part also, it bounces back and says you can't prove that this person is working with adults and therefore you actually can't do this check. Why wouldn't DBS want to do a full spectrum check on anybody? Is that a fair question? Tim, is that what you're going for also?
I would. The thing that strikes me as odd is that this information is for me. It's me requesting information about me. There is no disclosure of information, problem here. I'm asking about information about myself. So I'm a little bit confused as to why there is to use the word bar in two ways, why there is a bar to prevent me from doing that, because I'm asking for information about myself. There's no duty of care of information here. It's my information about me.
You should have a right to have access to that data.
I'm not quite sure that rights is the right thing here. I'm not particularly interested in that. What I'm interested in is can I get it? Because I want the shiniest list that I can and go to the people that want to employ me. Look, here we go. Look, shiny as it gets.
Yeah, but sorry, there's about 3 or 4 things piling up.
Yes.
I really need to tick off before we start having some misunderstandings. There's quite a. I'm trying to pick which one to start at. So I'll start with the question of what DBS limited information. First of all, DBS isn't the one that determines what information is and isn't disclosable. That is set by legislation. So the Protection of Freedoms Act 2012 is what sets, in conjunction with obviously the Safeguarding Vulnerable Groups Act 2006, that is the legislative basis in determining what information is available dependent on the job role that's being applied for. So it's not a case of DBS just providing all information available. It's a case of, is a person doing a job role that meets the criteria that's set out in the legislation in order to have that information checked and applied for. The second point, I think there's probably most pertinent to pick up on is, Tim, your point in terms of you applying for the information for yourself. That kind of comes back to the point I was making about there being a third-party suitability decision maker. The purpose of the DBS check isn't for you yourself to have access to the information. It's for a third party to determine whether or not you're actually suitable to do the job role that you've applied for the check for. So if you're a self-employed tutor, you applying for a DBS check, you are never, as a self-employed person, going to say that you yourself are unsuitable to do the job that you want to do. That is why there has to be a third party involved to say whether or not you're suitable to do the role. That's quite a
low trust judgment, assumption.
I completely understand that. That's not what I'm asking. I completely understand there has to be a third party involved. I have no issues with that whatsoever. My question is, why can't that third party provide me with every level of check? Why is it that they say, look, you can't have this level of check?
Well, that brings me back to the last point I made, which is you aren't engaging in regulated activity with adults. Therefore, the legislation won't allow you to apply for that level of check because there's no legal basis for that level of check. So because you aren't engaging in regulated activity with adults, there is no legal basis for you to submit that level of check or for an organized. Really, it comes down to the organization that is submitting the level of check. So in your typical sector that doesn't involve self-employed individuals, you would have an employer that is looking to employ an applicant. They would submit a DBS check based on the roles that person's going to be doing, who they're working with, how often they're doing them, all those factors that we looked at. They are going to submit a DBS check at the relevant level that they are allowed to in legislation. And when that check comes back, it's down to the applicant to provide that check to the organization. And it's then for the organization to decide that based on the information that's been disclosed on that level of check, are they suitable to carry out the job role that they want to employ them for? So that is the actual typical purpose of the DBS check. And I do appreciate that it's quite unique in this scenario. And just to touch on what Julia said, apologies if I misspoke. I wasn't making a judgment call in terms of a self-employed person saying they would never deem themselves unsuitable. My point was that the purpose of a DBS check being in the office of someone's employment to make a suitability decision is to have a third party decision maker in determining whether that person is suitable to carry out the job role. And that isn't a safeguard if there isn't a third-party decision maker in place to make a safer recruitment decision, because it would just be the individual determining that information about themselves, which isn't the usual process regarding a DBS check being in the office of
Jordan,
someone's
it occurs
employment.
to me, are you able to hear me? Because my computer's being weird again. Okay, great.
Yes, I can.
Jordan, and by the way, you're doing really, really well. It occurs to me that it's the difference between the CRB check and the DBS, where checking a criminal record would be something that I would be able to check my own criminal record, which I don't have. And but the focus of the word disclosure and barring is much more on the it's sort of put the focus on the employer or on the user of the services, as opposed to on the person who's owning the record. Does that sound right? That's where the shift in focus is?
Essentially, yes, because the DBS check itself is essentially for the purposes of the employer, so the employing organisation, to decide whether that person is suitable. I can see it's just popped up at the top of my screen that Julia's left, so maybe her computer has just given up. Can everyone still hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I think a couple of people just froze on my screen.
Yeah, no, I can hear
you.
Yeah, we can still hear you.
Now my phone has decided to start being funny. Hopefully everyone can still hear me.
Yeah, we can still hear you, Jordan.
Thank you. I think I'm back now. I think the closest point to touch on to what Julia just mentioned is, obviously, if it's in terms of just applying for the information yourself, you are still able to do that, and that is something that you can do at a basic check level. So a basic check can be applied for by the individual. They can go through a responsible organisation and submit the check on themselves, for themselves, and then use it for their own purposes. And if that's just for them to have the information themselves, that's something that you are able to do, because at a basic level, you are allowed to apply for the check yourself. For a standard and enhanced level, those checks are being applied for the employing organisation to be able to make a suitability decision based on the legislative criteria that is met, i.e. a person is doing actions or behaviours or responsibilities that are set out in the legislation that mean they are then eligible for the standard or enhanced levels of DBS check. And the check is then issued for the purposes of the employing organisation making a decision about whether that person is suitable to carry out the job role based on the information that's been disclosed on their check. So I suppose that is the key thing to remember in terms of applying for a DBS check at the standard or enhanced level. It's generally for the employing organisation to determine whether or not you are suitable to do the job role. Is Julia back in the room? Just because there's a point that I wanted to mention regarding that I think she would find particularly important regarding the parents. Because I know for a lot of
she's not back yet.
She's not back yet, but I'm here. We can hear you. Please do continue. She can hear you, or at least she'll know. I'm recording you, don't worry.
Fab. Okay. Just one of the things I wanted to touch on is, because it's something that Tim has mentioned, and it's something that Julia mentioned as part of her when we had a catch up as well, is in terms of the showing the information to the parents. That is something that we could potentially have a more discussion on, because the parents themselves aren't viewing your certificates in the office of their employment. So technically, if you are applying for a DBS check, for example, through qualified tutors, it would be down for qualified tutors to be making a suitability decision about whether or not you are able to register with them or to join their organisation, and therefore be matched with, for example, parents or individuals who require those tutoring needs. In terms of showing the certificate to the parents, obviously the information is your own on your DBS check, but in terms of making a suitability decision, that would be down to qualified tutors or the organisation that applies for the DBS check. It wouldn't be down for the parents to determine your suitability based on the information on your certificate, because technically the parents don't have the legal right to view the information on your certificate. If you choose to share that information with them, that is obviously the prerogative of the person who has the DBS check. It's your information. You can do with it what you will. But I just think that's worth touching on, that the DBS check wouldn't be for the parents. It would be for the organisation that is applying for the DBS check to make that suitability decision. And in this instance, that would be qualified tutors rather than being the parents, if my understanding is correct.
Yeah, that is. And it's quite useful as well to think about. And thank you for tolerating my Zoom dance that I'm doing here. It's quite interesting to think about our certification process, because what we've done is we've put the enhanced DBS inside a certification process that tests, that looks for other things as well: the terms and conditions, the insurance, the safeguarding training, and the verified client reviews. So what we're saying is, as a package, this is reassuring to parents, and interesting to think about whether and why a parent is not asking for DBS, really. And so your point about it not really being for parents is quite interesting. However, an educator who is a freelancer sees the parent as their client, as their end user. And there shouldn't necessarily be a need to put another party inside that. But I mean, that is why Qualified Tutor has interjected itself here, because there wasn't a way to create that clarity directly between tutors and parents. But it is worth noticing that that's what was really needed. That we've sort of created this thing to create peace of mind for parents. But really what Tim and Dee are asking for is to say, why wouldn't we be able to advocate for ourselves directly to parents as freelancers in any delivery, service that we're delivering?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that comes back to that making a suitability decision in the office of your employment. So you have to be employed to make suitability decisions as a third party to determine whether or not somebody is suitable to carry out that job role. So I think one of the most useful examples, Julie, that you touched on was in terms of when you send your children to school, you don't think about checking each teacher that your child is going to be going into the classes for, because you assume it's been done by the school. And that is correct, because the school will apply for the DBS checks for those teachers. The school will have their own recruitments of ex-offenders. They will have their own safer recruitment policies. They will have their own safeguarding policies. And parents have the peace of mind that that is being handled by the employer. In terms of your setup, in terms of tutors and qualified tutors, it's a mirror scenario there. But it would be that qualified tutors is acting as the school, as in qualified tutors is acting as the suitability decision maker. Therefore, if a parent is requesting tutoring and it's a tutor that is registered with qualified tutors, they should be able to rest assured that they don't have to ask to see the DBS check, because that the checking of the certificate, the safeguarding practices, the safe recruitment practices, they are being handled by qualified tutors as the organisation that is applying for those levels of DBS check. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Tim, go ahead.
So is there any legal obligation on other sort of like tutor providers that are larger organizations that employ other people to do this checking? Or it seems I can't quite work out what you're saying here, whether there is some legal obligation for. So, for example, if I advertise on various, find you some tutees websites, and I tick a little box saying I've got a DBS check, nobody's asked me to see the certificate. What's the situation there then?
It's difficult for me to comment on the practices of various tutor groups. I'm not asking you to comment on the practices. I'm asking you what the legal situation is, so that if so I don't even know why I'm asking you this. I'm going to stop. I'm just curious.
Don't know.
No, please feel free to. Yeah, I think I just want to. I don't want to. I just want to ensure that I'm actually answering the questions asked, rather than just spew DBS guidance at you. I think it's in terms of legal obligation. I think that's a useful point to touch on, because first of all, a DBS check is not a legal requirement from the DBS's point of view, and that is because we cannot legally mandate what levels of check are applied for. What DBS can advise on is what levels of DBS check is someone eligible for. So you'll never hear the DBS say that this is what level of check you must apply for, because we cannot legally mandate the level of check. we can say this is the level of check you can apply for based on the job role somebody's doing, based on all the legislative criteria we looked at. If there are, say, other tutoring organisations that say you can join our register if you have a DBS check, and you can just tick a box and say, yeah, I have one, and they aren't doing any kind of checks, that to me doesn't necessarily speak to a high standard of safe recruitment practices, because who's the suitability decision maker there? Because then you could potentially have a tutor that has, and this is a hypothetical scenario, you could potentially have a tutor who has a lot of information that has been disclosed on their DBS certificates, whether it be conviction information or local police force intelligence. If that individual is then able to join another tutoring register or a register with another tutoring organisation, and they can just tick a box saying, yes, I'm DBS checked. If the scenario that I mentioned is then how it's set up, whereby the parents trust that all relevant checks and balances have been done by that tutoring organisation, parents aren't the ones that are going to be seeing the DBS check, you could potentially have an individual who is providing that tutoring who has a ton of information on their DBS checks, but nobody's ever seen it because nobody has made that suitability decision. Whereas what should have happened there is, if you are ticking, yes, I have a DBS check, yes, I have an enhanced DBS check for tutoring because I provide teaching, training, and instruction to children, that organisation should then be saying, okay, let us see your existing DBS certificate and we will confirm that we will register you with our service, or no, we will apply for a new DBS check so it's up to date, so it's valid, so we've done all the ID verification, etc. And then they should confirm that they have carried out all the relevant checks and balances in terms of safe recruitment and safeguarding. Otherwise, that DBS check could have 10 pages of information on it, nobody's seen it, then no action can be taken on it. So the scenario should be, if somebody is saying you need a DBS check, as in that's another organisation saying you need it, not DBS. Obviously, there are some regulators, so Ofsted, Care Quality Commission, the Football Association, they will have legal rules in terms of what checks you have to have, but they are mandated by other organisations, as regulators. They are not mandated by DBS. And I suppose that is where it becomes an interesting question for areas that are unregulated. So if you are unregulated tutors, who is then putting the checks and balances in place? And that is obviously what Qualified Tutors is providing such a valuable and excellent service of doing, by joining the dots there between self-employed tutors, one that then allows them to have the DBS check at the correct and relevant level, and also provides the assurance to the parents and obviously the recipients of the tutoring, the teaching, training, instruction, that safe recruitment practices have been followed out, and there is a set process in place to ensure that anyone who is unsuitable at least can't, say, join Qualified Tutors as a registered network.
Yeah, I think that's there's so much there, Jordan, isn't there? And Dee, I did see that you put your hand up for a question. Let me just see if I can just speak to a few of those points. Firstly, one of the things that I've learned from you, Jordan, is the difference between the different meanings of the word regulated. So where you talk about regulated as any teaching role is a regulated profession, but tutoring is not regulated. So the activity of teaching is regulated, where regulated is a DBS term, which means eligible for checking, but there is no legal regulation sitting behind tutoring. And that discrepancy is the dot that we're joining here, because we're saying, let's be proactive. And even though there's no legal requirement to have DBS in place as a tutor, it is the right thing to do in order to keep children safe. And therefore, let's make it a norm by saying, since we're eligible, and that point that you said about it's not mandated, but it's about eligibility, that becomes a really high trust thing, doesn't it? Because that's assuming that someone like Tim wants the shiniest certificate because he's through and through the right person to work with children. So you're saying, let's only put those people in front of children. Let's only put the people who are proactive and taking a higher level of safety than is required legally. Yeah. And that actually will become the new norm. So a parent wouldn't dream of using somebody that doesn't have, for example, the QT certified credential behind them, because that gives a higher level of quality assurance. Tim, I have worked with so many tutors over the last few years who have told me that they've never been asked for DBS, they've never been given any safeguarding training, and it's astonishing and not okay.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, coming from a teaching background, I'm honestly, it's the Wild West. I'm frankly horrified. I noticed yesterday, actually, in my Facebook feed, there was some meeting in Parliament between some groups of tutors and the Education Select Committee, and I think it's about time. It's. I don't need to be glum about this, but you just can't help feeling it's another scandal just waiting to happen. It needs sorting out. It needs sorting out quick.
There are many of these scandals. They do come up every few months, and they do come up all over the world. And the fact that tutoring is, so easily accessible online makes it even more of an urgent issue. And absolutely, the profession has to take responsibility for it. I do think that there's a lot to unpack in terms of the gig economy, which means people who are working freelance, delivering services without an organization sitting behind them, which is a thing that has grown very, very much out of online connectivity. And so it sort of pushed us towards being more proactive and more sort of clear about what our credentials are. Jordan, would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not unique to the teaching sector. It's something that we see pop up in the care sector and in sports sectors. As Julia mentioned, it's about setting that standard. So, for example, if you are aware of several local sports groups in your area, and you know that one sports group doesn't have a policy relating to DBS checks, safe recruitment, but you know that in order to be a coach for one sporting organisation, you have to have a DBS check at a certain level, you have to have be on the update service, or any number of requirements, for example. It gives that beacon of, well, what the standard is at that sports organisation, and it gives that confidence that there is an element of safe recruitment that may not be in other areas.
And Jordan, when you describe it like that, it occurs to me that isn't it a strange thing that safety would become a beacon and a differentiator? Because really it should be the foundation. It should be
You'd hope it'd be the standard.
It should be the standard, and it should be a non-negotiable. Dee, we do have 3 minutes left. Do you want to dive in?
Yeah, I think I just wanted, as a comment, really. I've working with three tutoring businesses. The first one I connected with wanted to see a DBS certificate, and I used one that I'd got through volunteering at my church, and I had all the boxes said non-recorded because I was working with both children and adults. And then I was registered to work with Lucy's company, Education Boutique, and I did a DBS through them, but because it wasn't adults, the adult barring list says not requested. And I'm now using that certificate on the update service to show anyone who wants to see it.
I think there's a misunderstanding here. I don't think not requested is as problematic as it's sort of come across in this meeting. Not requested simply means you're not eligible to ask that question. Tim, go ahead.
No, but the thing is I'm looking at starting to work with adults as well, because I want to get into adult coaching. So I want to have that box ticked as well. So if they ask me, they make that. I mean, the thing is, a lot of people don't know. I mean, I've learned an awful lot about DBS here, and I suspect the majority of people out there, and that's why they don't ask, because they don't know they don't need to ask.
And teachers don't know either, because it's taken care of for them. And it's one of those things that we as freelance educators get to learn about in the same way as marketing and all those sort of elements of our job that goes beyond the role of teaching and learning. Tim, did you want to say something?
No, I was just going to comment that although it may be the case that the not requested thing isn't problematic, that's only because I now know it's not problematic.
Yeah.
If I was a parent looking at a certificate and it said not requested, I'd be like, well, why didn't they request that? What are they trying to hide?
Yeah.
I know it's not sinister.
It's semantic.
But it looks sinister.
Yeah. And it's just semantics. Jordan you used a phrase before. You said if a DBS wasn't checked and it had lots of information on it. Now, having spoken to you, I now know that means there were records on there of issues. But even that language it's not clear to a layman.
Absolutely, and I think even from a DBS standpoint, we appreciate that. Because everything's so heavily entrenched in legislation and everything is based on is the legislative criteria met, we appreciate that it's not always as plain English or as cut and dry as we would like it to be for organizations and recruiting bodies that have to follow the guidance. And that's part of what my role and the other outreach advisors' roles are there for as well, that if you do have any question at all relating to DBS, safeguarding, safe recruitment, you do have somebody there at the end of the line or at the end of an email who is there to provide advice, guidance, assistance, whether it be queries, phone calls, training sessions. We are trying to, it's about improving that understanding, and the more work we do, the better everyone's understanding will get and the more clarity people will have around DBS checks.
Well then, let's give you some feedback. You have absolutely brought light into a very hidden area for us, an area that feels very important and relevant that we really didn't know much about. You and I have spoken about doing some workshops together. Is something that you'd be happy to do now that you've seen how we behave?
Yeah, absolutely. More than happy to follow up with any. The workshops are really useful as well because they do give you a deep dive into what eligibility is, why it is what it is, and then what can be disclosed, and particularly the barring side of things as well. Again, focusing more on the safeguarding side of things, but it gives you a much more detailed look at how DBS processes and products work.
Fantastic. So I'm just going to wrap up with this. It was actually Odette that got in touch with the Disclosure and Barring Service originally, because she was alarmed as a parent to discover how few tutors have DBS as standard. And so we are incredibly glad to build this relationship with you and to be able to really take the lead on what it means to be safe as an educator, and doing our best to be proactive in that ways, and not say, well, it's not really our area, or I have one, or I don't need one because I'm a qualified teacher, or any of those things, but simply to do the right thing for the whole profession and lead the way and be that beacon that you mentioned. So Qualified Tutor is really, really chuffed to be able to participate in these conversations. Thank you to Jenna, thank you to Tim, thank you to Dee, thank you to Jordan, thank you to Hannah for managing my computer crashing. And I really, really look forward to the next conversation. Have a wonderful weekend, everyone. Thanks so
everyone.
much.
Thank you, Jordan.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Julian.